What does beauty really mean once youth fades and experience takes over? Is it flawless symmetry, or something far harder to define, harder to preserve, and harder to explain? Hollywood has always offered simple answers to that question. Youth, radiance, symmetry, illusion. The kind of beauty that can be lit, styled, edited, and sold. Yet Paul Newman, often ranked among the most handsome men ever to appear on screen, never seemed fully convinced by those answers. That contradiction alone invites curiosity. How does a man universally admired for his looks come to distrust the very currency that elevated him? And how does someone who embodied Hollywood's physical ideal quietly reject Hollywood's definition of beauty altogether? Those who worked alongside Newman say he rarely spoke about attractiveness in superficial terms. He noticed faces, yes, but more importantly, he noticed how people inhabited themselves. He observed intelligence, emotional steadiness, humor under pressure, and the way time reshaped a person rather than diminished them. While studios chased youth, Newman watched endurance. While Hollywood chased spectacle, he watched coherence. And perhaps that's why his perspective still resonates today, long after trends, faces, and icons have faded. So what kind of beauty impressed a man who had truly seen it all? Joanne Woodward, beauty that grows instead of fades. Every serious conversation about Paul Newman's understanding of beauty eventually circles back to Joanne Woodward, not out of obligation, but inevitability. In an industry famous for impermanence, their marriage lasted over 50 years. That fact alone raises uncomfortable questions for Hollywood's mythology. Was it luck? Discipline? Timing? Or did Newman recognize something deeper in Woodward that most people overlook entirely? Friends noticed a clear shift whenever Newman spoke about Joanne. When discussing actresses in general, his tone was observant, analytical, even detached. But when Woodward entered the conversation, something softened. His words slowed. The irony disappeared. The public latched onto his famous line about fidelity. Why go out for a hamburger when you have steak at home? Clever, memorable, repeated endlessly. But those close to the couple insist it was never about temptation, it was about sufficiency. Woodward didn't overwhelm rooms with glamour. She didn't rely on mystery or seduction. Her presence unfolded gradually. You noticed her elegance first, perhaps her poise. But it was only over time, through conversation, collaboration, conflict, that her depth revealed itself. She was intellectually formidable, emotionally disciplined, quietly fearless. She won an Academy Award before Newman did. That mattered, not as competition, but as confirmation. Newman admired effort. He admired seriousness. He admired people who refused shortcuts. Woodward approached acting like a craft, not a performance. She studied. She prepared. She respected the work. Newman saw that discipline as a form of beauty in itself. And then there was grief. The loss of their son, Scott Newman, fractured something in both of them. Yet those who witnessed their later years describe Newman looking at Joanne not with nostalgia, but reverence. As if shared pain had not diminished her beauty, but clarified it. So ask yourself, how often does attraction deepen with age instead of fading from it? How often does beauty become more compelling after illusion falls away? For Newman, Woodward represented a rare truth, beauty that survives time because it is built on respect, resilience, and shared reality. Grace Kelly, elegance without effort. If Joanne Woodward represented permanence, Grace Kelly represented something fleeting, but unforgettable. When Newman worked with Kelly on The Left-Handed Gun, she stood at the threshold between two worlds. Hollywood was losing her just as royalty was claiming her. Yet Newman wasn't impressed by her destiny. He was struck by her presence. Kelly did not dominate space. She refined it. On chaotic sets filled with movement and noise, she moved slowly, deliberately, never rushed, never strained. Newman once described her as silence in a loud room. That phrase lingers. When was the last time composure stood out more than charisma? When did restraint become more attractive than performance? Unlike many actresses whose beauty depended heavily on lighting, styling, or context, Kelly remained remarkably consistent. She appeared the same in rehearsal rooms, cafeterias, and formal sets. The elegance was not manufactured. It was internal. Raised with strict discipline and structure, Kelly carried herself with an almost architectural balance. Her beauty wasn't expressive, it was contained. That containment gave it power. Newman reportedly said she was the only actress who seemed more natural as a princess than a movie star. Not because of fantasy, but because dignity came effortlessly to her. Her departure from Hollywood felt inevitable. She belonged to a world that valued restraint over exhibition, continuity over reinvention. So here's the question. Is elegance something you perform, or something you protect? For Newman, Kelly's beauty lay in coherence. There was no distance between who she appeared to be and who she actually was. And that alignment, he believed, was rare. Elizabeth Taylor, beauty with fire behind it. If Grace Kelly was silence, Elizabeth Taylor was thunder. Though Newman never worked directly with Taylor, her presence was unavoidable. She did not pass through Hollywood quietly, she reshaped it. What captivated Newman wasn't merely her legendary violet eyes. It was her refusal to be contained. Taylor didn't seek admiration from afar, she demanded emotional engagement. She loved publicly. She suffered publicly. She aged publicly. And in doing so, she dismantled the industry's most carefully guarded illusions. Newman once remarked that Taylor didn't want to be observed, she wanted to be felt. That kind of beauty unsettles people. It resists control. It refuses distance. Taylor lived without filters. Multiple marriages. Illness. Weight fluctuations. Addiction. Recovery. She incorporated every phase of life into her identity instead of hiding behind fantasy. What impressed Newman most wasn't her beauty, but her courage. She refused disappearance. While Hollywood quietly discarded aging women, Taylor adapted. She claimed space. She transformed vulnerability into presence. Newman reportedly said she seemed to enjoy growing older, an idea that felt almost rebellious in Hollywood. So ask yourself, what if beauty had less to do with preservation, and more to do with permission? For Newman, Taylor's allure burned because it came with honesty. Her beauty wasn't stable, but it was real. Sophia Loren, confidence that needed no permission. When Newman worked with Sophia Loren on Lady L, he encountered a kind of beauty Hollywood struggled to define. Loren did not reshape herself for American sensibilities. She arrived fully formed, accent, curves, emotional expressiveness intact. She did not apologize. She did not adapt. She did not negotiate her identity. Newman once said that when Loren entered a room, every man became irrelevant, not because she sought attention, but because she didn't need it. That distinction mattered deeply to him. Loren's confidence was not performative. It was settled. She laughed loudly. She cried openly. She embraced vulnerability without fear of losing control. Unlike actresses who guarded their appearance obsessively, Loren allowed herself to look tired, aged, imperfect, if the role demanded it. Newman admired that she was an actress first and a symbol second. So here's the question. Is true confidence louder or quieter? For Newman, Loren embodied a European philosophy of beauty, one that respected maturity, intellect, and emotional truth over illusion. Brigitte Bardot, beauty that broke the rules. Though Newman never worked with Brigitte Bardot, he recognized her cultural significance immediately. Bardot didn't refine beauty, she disrupted it. Her hair was messy, her movements unpolished, her sexuality uncontained. She didn't appear styled, she appeared alive. Newman once observed that Bardot seemed uninterested in approval. She moved as though the camera were irrelevant. That indifference changed everything. Before Bardot, beauty on screen was curated. After her, it became personal, raw, casual, uncontrolled. She didn't perform allure, she inhabited it. Her influence spilled beyond film into fashion, culture, and self-expression. Tousled hair, minimal makeup, relaxed sensuality. Freedom replaced formality. Newman saw Bardot not as a bombshell, but as a revolution. So consider this. How often does beauty change culture instead of simply decorating it? For Newman, Bardot's power came from autonomy. Her allure belonged to her, not to the audience. Paul Newman's quiet conclusion on beauty. Across these women, Woodward, Kelly, Taylor, Loren, Bardot, a pattern emerges. Paul Newman was never impressed by perfection alone. He was drawn to alignment, when appearance, character, and presence moved together. Some women captivated him through stillness, others through fire, others through confidence or rebellion. But in every case, beauty was inseparable from identity. And perhaps that is Newman's most enduring lesson. In a world obsessed with surfaces, he understood something deeper. Beauty that lasts is never just seen, it is experienced over time. Paul Newman and the many faces of beauty, what Hollywood rarely understood. So what does real beauty actually look like? Is it symmetry, youth, sex appeal? Or is it something quieter, something that remains long after the spotlight fades? Paul Newman lived long enough to watch faces disappear and reputations dissolve. Yet the women who stayed with him, intellectually, emotionally, philosophically, shared one thing in common. They were fully themselves. In an industry built on illusion, Newman valued truth. In a culture obsessed with youth, he admired endurance. In a world chasing novelty, he respected depth. And perhaps that's why his perspective feels increasingly relevant today. So here's the final question. If beauty is inseparable from character, what kind of beauty are we really chasing? Audrey Hepburn, the beauty that invited, not demanded. It's easy to mistake understatedness for absence. In the loud world of Hollywood, bright lights, blaring publicity machines, and an industry that often equated femininity with spectacle, Audrey Hepburn arrived like a soft exhale. Her beauty wasn't an event, it was a continual invitation. Where other actresses were billed as sensations, Hepburn was a presence. That difference felt, to many who worked with her, like a small revolution. Picture a set in the 1950s. Technicians maneuvering cameras like orchestral musicians, gaffers moving in practiced choreography, and publicists hovering at the edge of soundstages. Into that mechanical, rehearsed bustle stepped Audrey, thin, almost fragile in outline, but with a posture that suggested a lifetime of discipline. She moved like someone trained to minimize wasted motion. Every shift of weight was purposeful, every tilt of the head quiet. Yet there was a magnetism there that didn't demand applause. It asked only to be noticed. Why do we often assume that charisma must shout? How does something so softly offered end up being unforgettable? Paul Newman, anyone who spent time with him knows he was an acute observer of people, spoke of Hepburn as if describing a very particular weather. Constant, temperate, and quietly transformative. He noticed that her beauty didn't function as a spotlight. Instead, it created a zone of concentration. When she was in a frame, other faces didn't dim. Rather, the entire frame seemed to take on a different kind of light. People leaned forward not because she forced them, but because her presence made them want to know more. Hepburn's face carried memory. The shadow of war, the starvation, the upheaval of a childhood spent moving between countries, was not something she wore like armor. It had settled into the soft planes of her face, the quiet hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way her mouth could close into a line of gentle fortitude. Those who knew her would later talk about how much of her inner life it suggested. She had learned deprivation, she had learned gratitude, she had learned how to conserve herself for the things that mattered. Do you ever look at someone and wonder what years of silence and steady work have taught them? There's a scene worth imagining. Newman watching Hepburn between takes on a studio lot, the noise of 100 small tasks humming around them. She was reading a letter, perhaps, or tracing a pattern with her finger across a script's edge. Her beauty was not the point of the scene, it was the byproduct of focus. It was this humility, this refusal to allow the world to mistake her physical features for the sum of who she was, that drew him. She turned beauty into question. What does it mean to be beautiful and intentional? How does kindness translate on film? Hepburn's life later in years, far from the superficial trappings, became a kind of answer. After the roar of a Hollywood career, she devoted herself to humanitarian work with the same composure she had on camera. The planes of her face aged the way genuine things do, with the accrual of experience. She resisted the industry's pressure to perpetuate youth as a mandate. Instead, she aged into purpose, letting her beauty become a testimony to a life stitched to service. For Newman, that was what true attractiveness ultimately meant: alignment. When the outward matched the inward, beauty stayed, not as an ornament but as a witness. When you think of someone you admire, do you value their looks, their actions, or the space between the two? Lauren Bacall. Power wrapped in calm confidence. If Hepburn's beauty was a drawn curtain, Lauren Bacall's was the room itself. Furnished, lit, and arranged with intent. Bacall didn't enter to be seen. She entered to rearrange the room's energy. People responded to her in a different register. They felt tested, measured, balanced. She had a voice that lowered environments, as if the air itself took on weight when she spoke. It's tempting, when we try to describe Bacall's magnetism, to lean on the mechanics. The deep voice shaped by hawks, the precise slow drawl designed for young actresses to sound older. Those are true, certainly. But again, technique is only the framework. What filled it was something less teachable: an absolute self-possession. That self-possession was a kind of honesty in motion. Bacall didn't need to press her power into people. She merely occupied it, and others had to accommodate. How different would the world be if more people entered spaces with that level of certainty? Not loud, but immovable. The earliest footage of Bacall reveals that even as a teenager she carried the confidence of someone who had decided precisely what she would and would not be. She did not soften herself to fit the contours of men's gazes. She hardened, in a sense, into a self that could be relied on. That strength made her dangerous, not in a physical sense, but in social dynamics. She altered balance. When she stood beside men like Humphrey Bogart, the pairing did not flatten her into a tag-along. It created a duet, two strong lines intersecting, neither canceling the other. Newman saw in Bacall something like a philosophical case for beauty as authority. She reminded him that attractiveness could manifest as agency. Calm, deliberate, in no need of flattery. Her characters had decision-making authority. They pushed narratives rather than waited for them. That kind of screen presence, beauty with breaks, beauty with a compass, offered a model for women of the era and for audiences who wanted to see characters with interior lives that did not exist only to feed male arcs. Isn't it still remarkable how rare that is? Someone who steps into the foreground and refuses to be a temperate presence designed only to support someone else's story? There were private moments that confirmed what Newman and his peers noticed in public. On late-night sets, where makeup was stripped and the cameras were off, Bacall was not a softened portrait but a full person, with tastes and irritations and humor. She liked conversation that went beyond the surface. She favored intelligence. To be with her was to be measured against something internal, a set of values that refused to be negotiated away for fame. In that way, her beauty was a moral force. It compelled respect before desire. Ali McGraw. When vulnerability became the point. If Bacall's beauty stood like a lamp, McGraw's arrived like sunlight flooding in and revealing the dust motes, an exposure that made the ordinary feel painfully intimate. By the 1970s, the cultural ground had shifted. The gloss of Eisenhower-era control gave way to a hunger for authenticity. Audiences were tired of perfection. They wanted to know how it felt to bruise, to love, to be wounded. Into that yearning stepped Ali McGraw. Her appearance in Love Story was a study in how fragility can be a form of attraction. But it was not simply that she looked fragile. It was how transparently she let emotion register. She was not performing resilience. She was showing the process of being human. The way feelings gather, grow, and then spill. In an era of choreography and practiced mask, that nakedness felt revolutionary. Why do we trust faces that show us what they're feeling? Is it because they offer us permission to feel the same? Newman was struck by McGraw because she destabilized the theatrical rules. Where other actresses developed craft as a shield, control over every blink, every intake of breath, McGraw allowed control to slip at crucial moments. The result was not amateurism. It was a performance that understood authenticity as technique. She taught viewers the grammar of being seen. It was as if she raised a mirror and said, "You can look. I am as flawed and open as you are." Her style, soft hair, natural makeup, a certain unplanned slouch, spoke to a generation that wanted to stop editing its edges. She was not constructed to be looked at. She was an experience you entered. People didn't love her because she was perfect. They loved her because she made them feel less alone in their imperfections. Could the rise of women like McGraw be read as a collective admission that we were craving honesty more than spectacle? Newman's own reflections on her suggested that he admired not just the emotional transparency but the courage behind it. To let vulnerability become the point is to risk being misread as weak. McGraw turned that risk into an asset. Her work announced that the most persuasive kind of beauty could include suffering, if suffering was honest, not performative. What Paul Newman really understood about beauty. If we catalog the women Newman admired, the list reads less like a greatest hits of feminine aesthetics and more like a mosaic of modes, each tile shaped differently but fitted into a coherent picture. Hepburn's humility, Bacall's sovereignty, McGraw's vulnerability. Add to that Joanne Woodward's deep, lived-in moral center, Grace Kelly's composed refinement, Elizabeth Taylor's stormy intensity, Sophia Loren's unapologetic sensuality, and Brigitte Bardot's untethered freedom. The pattern that emerges suggests that Newman was less a collector of prettiness than a student of personhood. Isn't it fascinating how different temperaments can all register as beautiful if looked at through the right lens? Beauty, for Newman, was less a surface attribute and more an intersection of history, temperament, and choice. It required context. He appreciated how someone's life informs the plane of their face. The small, repeated moral decisions, the ways people treat each other, the subtle back and forth of a character's interior life. When appearance echoed those inner grooves, it became persuasive, durable. It told stories that a publicity stunt never could. There's an image I keep returning to. Newman on a porch after a long day of filming, cigarette smoldering between his fingers, watching people move through the world and wondering about the time it takes for a person to become themselves. He was married to Joanne Woodward, an anchor in his life, and that marriage, by all accounts, was serious and devoted. That devotion shaped his view. He could admire other women without confusing admiration with desire. He recognized that admiration is often, at its purest, an appreciation of craft and character. How do we honor admiration without reducing it to possession? Reflecting on Newman's statements, one detects a moral backbone. He did not fetishize physical traits in isolation. He framed beauty as an ethical phenomenon. This is why he found the glamour industry's obsession with youth and novelty shallow. Real attractiveness, to him, was what happened when a person's exterior harmonized with their inner commitments. Kindness, intelligence, curiosity, humility, courage. Age should, under that understanding, refine beauty rather than steal it away. But what does this mean for those of us living now, in an era when faces are filtered and time itself seems marketable? Newman's perspective is also a lens through which to critique modern culture. The relentless appetite for newness, the habit of scoring worth by popularity metrics, the tendency to make the momentary into the permanent. He saw beauty as cumulative. That does not mean attractiveness was always obvious from the first impression. Often, it needed time to reveal itself. Small gestures, a pattern of behavior, the way someone treated their own failures. Isn't there something deeply democratic about that definition? That beauty isn't a single attribute you either possess or not, but a life you assemble? Portraits and backstories. Let's step behind the glossy frames and imagine a few private scenes. Small vignettes that might illuminate why these women lodged so firmly in Newman's reflection. Audrey Hepburn at night. Imagine Hepburn arriving late at a hospital in some country where UNICEF had just opened a small clinic. The street is uneven, puddles catching lamplight. She walks with deliberate slowness, hands folded. Inside, she kneels near a cot and speaks to a child as if reading a poem. Her manner is both respectful and entirely free of theater. The child laughs, a surprise sound, and Hepburn laughs back, a low, musical thing. She doesn't offer platitudes. She listens. Afterwards, a nurse mentions something about costume fittings and cameras, and Audrey pauses, her face softening. There is only one way to use the attention, she says, and that is for work that matters. Is it possible to describe something kinder than that? Lauren Bacall at midnight. Picture Bacall at a late-night poker game, cigarette in hand, laughing in a way that sounds like a closed door opening. The men at the table try to draw her into gossip, into the kind of talk that reduces people to headlines. She answers, but with a phrase that deflects, with an observation that elevates the discourse. Someone asks if she is ever afraid of being typecast into the role of the dangerous woman. She draws a line with her finger in the air and says, "Dangerous? Perhaps. But mostly I'm just uninterested in being a prop." Do you feel that chill of recalibration? How quickly a single sentence can change the tone of a room. Ali McGraw on set. Envision McGraw between takes, the sun sliding across the trailer window, script pages in her lap. She murmurs to a co-star about an early heartbreak, not seeking sympathy but offering context. The co-star, taken aback, realizes that the wrinkles on a line of dialogue are not merely words but traces of lived pain. She folds the script away and says, "We are all walking around with unread chapters." Wouldn't you want to sit down with someone who recognizes that? Joanne Woodward, Grace Kelly, Elizabeth Taylor, Sophia Loren, Brigitte Bardot, each of these women carried their own private vignettes, their own soft and sharp recollections. Newman appreciated that the stories behind their faces mattered. Woodward's depth came from a long apprenticeship in character study. Grace Kelly's elegance came through an almost monastic restraint. Elizabeth Taylor's intensity came from the conflagrations of love and publicization. Sophia Loren's sensuality was braided with pride and defiance. Brigitte Bardot's freedom was a performance of self-ownership. How much of what we call beauty is the biography we attach to a face? Lessons and small tests. Newman's notes about beauty feel, in the end, like a set of moral exercises. He seemed to ask himself, and us, to run a few simple tests. Can you age without losing yourself? This is not about clinging to youth, but about admitting the passage of time into your identity without letting culture reduce you to a series of touch-ups. Do you treat others with decency when no one is watching? This is the slow test, the one that reveals whether beauty is an accessory or an integrated trait. Are you willing to be vulnerable? Not performative vulnerability, but the hard kind that risks judgment because it insists on honesty. Can you hold power without weaponizing it? Many confuse force with health. Newman admired women who could exert influence while remaining ethical. Do your actions match your claims? When public glamour meets private goodness, the result is magnetic in a way that publicity stunts cannot replicate. Are these tests too idealistic? Or are they a humane standard to which any of us could aspire? Looking ahead, what kind of beauty will we choose? Newman's reflections, gentle, discerning, often disarming, are not mere nostalgia. They are a practical manifesto for evaluating what we honor in one another. In an era when images proliferate and the metrics of attention reward immediacy, his wisdom suggests patience. He asks us to look for the accumulation, the consistency, the small increments that cohere into character. What would it mean to value goodness as part of attractiveness? How differently would our media look? How differently would we act toward one another? When we stare at glossy feeds filled with faces curated to perfection, Newman's view asks us to pause. Is this beauty in service of a life, or is it an advert for a moment? Hepburn, Bacall, McGraw, each in her way, taught that beauty is not simply what secures audiences but what holds up under scrutiny. It is elegy and invitation both. To close, let me circle back to the question you posed at the start. What kind of beauty are we choosing to value today? The most radical act may not be dramatic reinvention but persistent fidelity. To kindness, to craft, to aging with dignity, to telling the truth. Paul Newman's gaze found that fidelity wherever it existed. He saw it in Hepburn's charity and restraint, in Bacall's sovereign calm, in McGraw's unguarded emotion, and in the other women whose names we recited. He admired the ways people's outward shapes reflected their interior commitments. Maybe the future of beauty is less about trends and more about these small moral continuities. The person who shows up, the hand that steadies, the voice that refuses to be bought. Those are the faces that last. Those are the faces that invite rather than demand. Those are the faces that, finally, teach us how to be beautiful in a world that often mistakes spectacle for soul.